Imagine leaving everything you've ever known out of the possibility of creating a better life for yourself and your family, just to withstand more hardships along the way with no reward guaranteed at the end. Immigration is an issue central to most countries, but there's a particular crisis occurring right now within the European Union as refugees from Syria and Eastern Europe flee their homelands. The EU hasn't had to deal with large numbers of these refugees coming into Western Europe since the 1940s, and they aren't prepared to deal with the issue today using the same old policies that don't demand the cooperation and joint efforts of all countries within the Union. As refugees flee their homelands by the thousands, the EU can no longer choose to ignore the flaws in the current policy regarding the joint registration and care of those entering the Union, and can no longer allow countries barring their borders to continue without repercussions so as to equally burden all cooperating governments and improve the overall health of refugees undergoing the slow legal process of legalizing their westward movement. Current policy in the EU has only a vague outline that calls for the joint efforts of all countries within the Union to handle the immigration of persons from third world countries. It gives no word of anything how it's supposed to be done or possible consequences that can come to countries that choose to refuse to comply. And it only vaguely says that these people are supposed to be picked up within the Union. In Title V, Chapter 2, Article 80 of the Treaty of Lisbon, it's stated that the policy of the Union and their implementation shall be governed by the principle of solidarity and fair sharing of responsibility, including its financial implementations between the member states through any appropriate measures to give effect to its principle. All of the other parts of this entire treaty are very vague as well, saying anybody from a third world country can seek asylum within the Union. The Union's supposed to work together. It doesn't actually give a guideline or say what happens if they choose to not. Hardly any immigrants right now have been accepted by Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic or Slovakia, and it's led to an unequal burden placed on to countries such as Germany, Greece, and Italy, financially and just through population. Hungary has fenced off part of its borders with Serbia and Croatia in hopes of keeping out immigrants, actually, and it led to an EU meeting that was productive in bringing this issue to light, but it didn't actually solve anything, and it just led to a lawsuit between Hungary and the EU. Because of this, masses of immigrants are stuck at different borders and forced to come in illegally through more dangerous routes, the most common being the dangerous Baltic Sea crossing. Many people have drowned, and they're not legal once they get here, so it's possible that they can be sent right back. Hotspots for refugee registration are largely inefficient. Only 2 are working out of the 11 that were promised by the EU. Because the current policy isn't roping in all countries to work together, many refugees are dying and suffering a seriously decreased quality of life. Refugees have little food available to them in refugee camps and few different varieties of food once they do have any. There were studies done that showed that chronic illnesses could come out of these different poor conditions, and that the stress that these people face every day eventually leads to their downfall. Chronic diseases are rampant within these camps and in between points while awaiting registration due to stress and lack of medical care and appropriate housing. The diseases spread as immune systems of refugees are compromised due to stress and poor conditions, and these diseases then can potentially spread to the normal populations of these countries. Millions of individuals take the dangerous decision to illegally cross into the EU because the process currently takes far too long, and many die or are seriously injured during the crossing. Hypothermia is rampant for those that try and cross on small dinghies across the Mediterranean and the Baltic. A number of these deaths are through these ocean crossings, and because the borders are closed at more land-based crossings, they have to do it. The UN was actually forced to reduce coverage due to the lack of funding and largely overpopulated passport-free zones, so now there's even less opportunity for these people to be safely in the EU. Although a few countries have been forced to pick up the slack caused by these countries carrying their borders to the refugees, barring them, the process of refugee registration seems excessively long, and there's a logic behind their reasoning for it. To completely open the borders of the EU would be disastrous for the economy of the EU, and it would potentially doom all of its countries. However, by completely closing off some of the borders of these countries, the others are forced to pick up the slack, and the aid for these refugees is spread too thinly. So not only is one country overburdened, but the refugees living there don't have the necessary needs, and they can't survive. The process of registration is extensive to ensure that only displaced persons from third world countries are coming to the EU and seeking asylum, which is understandable, and the treaty doesn't call for an open border at all. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that yes, asylum seekers should be the only ones easily allowed into the EU, and that's understandable because it's the only way that a government could sustain large amounts of people coming in. However, with the current mass influx, more people need to be on hand to deal with the issue more now than they have in past years, and the process has to be more streamlined than it is currently. By freeing up the no passport in limbo zones in places like Norway or other further north countries, the routes coming into the EU would be safer and less people would die along the way. In conclusion, today, with Syrian refugee crisis, the current policy in place has to change to keep up with the times. Too many lives have been lost, and too many countries are overburdened while others try and just flee their responsibilities. In order to stand with the European Union and the policies that they stand by normally, things have to change. Thank you.